Now that we've gone ahead and gotten some common vocabulary, we're going to go ahead and start talking about how we standardize our notation. Now, I want to go ahead and admit I'm going to throw a bunch of different notation at you today, and so some of it you might not be familiar with. That is some of the concepts you might not have seen before. And that's okay, we're going to get more in depth in it later. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the notation now so you've seen it before. Now, when we go to talk about notation, we're going to go ahead and divide it up into talking about, might help if I had a pencil, into stuff for our sample and stuff for our population. So let's go ahead and talk about sample first. The first important part of our sample is going to be our sample size. This is going to be represented with a lowercase n. For instance, we might say our sample had 50 people, and if this is the case, then we can also just say n equals 50. So that can be the number of people or the number of objects in our sample. The next thing we're going to talk about is an average. We're going to learn later on that there are a couple different types of average. We're talking specifically about the mean in this case. And our mean, we're going to represent by an x with a bar over the top of it, and that's a lowercase x. Now, I want to go ahead and admit this isn't universally standard. That is, other textbooks might use slightly different notation. For instance, you might see something like a y bar. You might see other letters with a bar over the top of them as well. So if you see the bar over the top, it's a pretty safe assumption we're talking about an average with it. A good example of that is if I say, out of 25 students, average age was 19. In this case, I have my average age, so x bar is 19, and I also know that n is 25. Now, aside from sample size and average, next thing we want to talk about is what we call our proportion. A proportion is just our decimal representation of a percentage. And the symbol we're going to use for this is going to be p, that's a lowercase p to be specific, and a little hat on top of it. So, a good example of this is if we say, out of 100 people, 25% prefer cats. Now, in this case here, we can go ahead and see that we have a sample size, that is n equals 100, and we also have a proportion, so we'll use p hat to represent that. In this case, p hat, the percentage of our sample is 25%, so the decimal representation of that is 0.25. And in case you've forgotten to convert a percentage to a decimal, we just divide it by 100. So 25 divided by 100, 0.25 there. So far, we have our sample size, our average, and our proportion. There's one more we're going to go ahead and introduce here, and this is what's called standard deviation. It's okay if you haven't heard of this before. For now, just understand it's a measure of how spread out people are. So are they all giving exactly the same answers? Are they giving extremely different answers? That's kind of what standard deviation measures. And we're going to use a lowercase s to represent the standard deviation of our sample. Now, I want to be clear here that each of these has to do with the sample, which means that when I look at this, these values here are statistics. And once again, they're statistics because they're coming from the actual sample itself.